Good evening, barflies and lounge lizards, and tonight we'll be discussing some of my favorite classic sci-fi video games. Essentially, classic video games with a sci-fi theme. And by classic, I mean basically the first generation up to about the 16-bit generation. And let me tell you, this was a difficult list to put together. And I just wanted to say again that these are just my personal favorites. Games I played as a kid. And number 5 on the list is Space Invaders from 1978 by Taito. Developed by Tomohiro Nishikado, Space Invaders is a shoot-'em-up that hit arcades in 1978, and it would go on to be released on platforms ranging from the Atari 2600 to the original Nintendo, all the way to watches and even calculators. It is widely considered the first shoot-'em-up, and in it the player plays as a small spaceship blasting alien invaders. Being an arcade game from the 70s, there really isn't any story per se, but there was some fantastic cabinet art featuring a quite intimidating looking, shadowy Ukla Damak that really told you all you needed to know. Now, Space Invaders began as something completely different, featuring tanks, planes, and battleships, but Nishikado-san just never felt the enemy movement was very good. He debated using people, but thought that might not go over too well. But then after seeing the 1974 anime Space Battleship Yamato, as well as a magazine feature about the original Star Wars, he decided on a space theme instead. As to the alien design, inspiration was taken from not only squids and crabs, but also the H.G. Wells classic War of the Worlds. And the game was originally called Space Monsters, but it was changed to Space Invaders by the higher-ups at Taito. Now, this is one I do enjoy, but my fondness for it actually comes from the 1982 animated short film Arcade Attack, where a group of pinball heroes take on Space Invader style aliens. I remember catching that, I'm pretty sure on HBO between movies, and it just captured my imagination like nothing else. I was so fascinated with it that even though I saw it that one time, it stuck with me through my entire life, but I thought it was kind of a lost thing. Then good old YouTube comes along, and sure enough, I was eventually able to find it. And speaking of the aliens, I also had a little rubber suction cup glow-in-the-dark quarter machine toy of one of the invaders when I was a kid. And I love that thing as well. I mean, you talk about a bunch of things hitting all my different fancies. Glow-in-the-dark, aliens, toys. That right there, that was some good times. And number 4 on the list is Godzilla, Monster of Monsters from 1989 by Toho for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Developed by Compile, Monster of Monsters tells the story of another alien invasion, this time from Planet X, and those wacky Planet Xians are using a group of space monsters, even though they weren't all technically space monsters, to conquer the Earth. And Godzilla and Mothra, they just aren't having that. And that's just one of the things I love about 60s and 70s era Godzilla, just how deep into sci-fi it got. But that's not what this is about. Now, this is a side-scrolling, almost beat-em-up style game where you can play as either Godzilla or Mothra. What's interesting is the game begins on a game board type deal, and you move your monsters to hexagons to play stages or fight other kaiju in a one-on-one battle. And once the board is clear of monsters, you move on to the next board, which if I remember correctly is another planet. This game was a really important piece of my pop culture youth. I was a big Godzilla fan already, and this was one of my most wanted and anticipated gifts for Christmas that year. But at the time, I had a limited knowledge of Godzilla and his world, basically just what I knew from Good Times video releases and whatever films were shown on Grandpa Munster's Super Scary Saturday. But this one introduced me to a bunch of characters I had never seen before, like Hedorah, Varan, and the interweb kaiju approved Gezora from the 1970 film Space Amoeba. And Gezora wasn't the only kind of guest spot in the game. Matango appears as a mid-level boss as well, as does the battleship from the 1977 film War in Space. You know, thinking about it, Gezora, Matango, that would have made a pretty good soup. There was a sequel to this one, but in it you played as the army trying to defeat Godzilla. Let's just say I passed on that one. And number 3 on the list is Chrono Trigger from 1995 by Square for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Developed by a who's who of impressive talent, as well as 3 rather impressive directors, Chrono Trigger is a sci-fi RPG and one of the best of the 16-bit generation. On first glance, it may appear to be a fantasy game, but it features heavy sci-fi elements with time travel being one of the primary plot points. The party moves through time throughout this game, including a prehistoric version of their world, medieval times, the future, and a very distant future. You even get a very charming looking robot in your party as a playable character. Then there is of course the sword and sorcery element with magic and a frog warrior who joins the party as well. I don't want to say too much about the plot, for it's a doozy of a story. And there's even more sci-fi to the story, but that kind of dips into spoiler territory. And I know what you're saying, you magnificent bastard. Just spoil it for us. Tell us about the aliens. I am really not at liberty to speak about the aliens at this time. This was another Christmas gift, and it really just took RPGs to the next level. And one of the most interesting factoids about this game was the character design was done by Akira Toriyama, who is probably most famous for Dragon Ball Z. But he also did the Dragon Quest aka Dragon Warrior games, which really allowed them to stand out and set themselves apart from the Final Fantasy series. But jumping back to Chrono Trigger, the game's graphics programmer said that Ridley Scott's Alien was one of the main inspirations for the lighting in this game. This is one that's been released and re-released several different times on several different systems, and it is a highly recommended play. And with that, we should take some kind of break.
Atari Anonymous. My son Boris has a missile command problem.
My mission in life is to save all of mankind.
Lately, my daughter has developed a similar problem with Atari warlords. Now with video pinball, my husband is acting funny lately. With Atari games so ingenious, so involving, so intense, I ask you, Atari Anonymous, is this problem contagious?
And number 2 on the list, and I didn't do this on purpose, is Mega Man 2 from 1988 by Capcom for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Outsiders to the Mega Man world may think that it's a superhero series, but it is in fact a robot series, with nearly the entire cast being made up of robots, the titular Mega Man, Rockman in Japan, being one as well. Directed by Akira Kitamura, who also created the character along with Keiji Inafune, Mega Man takes place in the distant future of 2000X. The series villain, Dr. Wily, is back and has created a group of evil robots for some evil robot activities. And so friendly android Rock is off to save the day, which he can do in any order he pleases. This is an action platformer that is easily the best game of the series in my almost humble opinion. Great character designs, a ton of fun, and accessible to new players. It also has some of the best music of that generation. And I know this gets quoted often, but the music in the first stage of Wily's Fortress, incredible. Matter of fact, let's listen to some of that right now. Hot dog. And though this is a classic now, at the time, there was some resistance within Capcom to even get this made. The first game really didn't set the world on fire, but Kitamura wanted to do a sequel anyways. He would end up having to jump over some heads and actually go to Capcom's vice president to get the green light. The green light was given, but only if the team agreed to work on other projects at the same time, with said projects taking priority. The staff spent much of their own time working on Mega Man 2. And now it's time for an honorable mention. And this one is only in this section because I didn't actually play it as a kid. Well, not really. It's kind of a cheat, but we play fast and loose with the rules here at the snack bar. But that's Space Ace from 1984, produced by Bluth Entertainment,
Here's some money. Go see a Star Wars.
Cinematronics, and Advanced Microcomputer Systems. Space Ace is a Laserdisc-based space adventure game featuring film-quality animation by the aforementioned Don Bluth, a former Disney animator. And it tells the story of space hero Dexter, also known as Ace, as he attempts to stop the villainous Commander Borf, who plans to turn the Earth's adults into infants with his fancy new ray gun. Things go downhill for our buddy Ace as he not only gets partially hit with the Infanto Ray, but also has his lovely sidekick kidnapped by Borf. If I had a nickel, though to be fair, it's usually me tied to the chair by a supervillain and no one comes to save me. This was a follow-up, in a sense, to Dragon's Lair from 1983, using the same style of gameplay in that wonderful Don Bluth animation. And much like Dragon's Lair, Space Ace featured individual animated scenes in which the player had to use the joystick or fire button at just the right moment in order to progress through. And if you missed an input, that's all she wrote. I do remember seeing this one in the arcade as a kid, but Dragon's Lair had been so difficult, not to mention that these Laserdisc games cost more to play, I never gave it a shot. I did though watch from over some shoulders, and remember thinking it looked like 12 tons of awesome. It was essentially an interactive animated movie. And since we're speaking about Don Bluth, The Secret of Nim was regular viewing in my household as a lad, far more than any Disney animated film at the time. I even want to say I had it on Betamax. Space Ace cost about $2.5 million to make and featured the same production team as Dragon's Lair. In order to cut costs a bit, most of the voices of the game were handled by the staff, including Bluth himself. Okay, I'll stop making that joke now, I promise. But Bluth voiced Commander Borf. One notable exception was narrator Michael Rye, who also worked on Dragon's Lair. Rye was a radio, TV, and voice actor who appeared on 77 Sunset Strip and Perry Mason. He also did quite a bit of voice work for Super Friends, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and the Real Ghostbusters. I would also like to mention Galaga, Berserk, and Yar's Revenge, all three of which would have been great games for this list, but again, I just didn't play them as a kid. But if you folks like this episode, I will expand things greatly and cover all three and even start digging into computer games. And number one on the list, Super Metroid from 1994 by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo. Developed by the legendary R&D1, Super Metroid is easily the high-water mark for classic sci-fi gaming, as well as one of the progenitors of my favorite genre of game, the Metroidvania, and it is just thick with mood, atmosphere, and is downright spooky at times, and it tells the story of a space bounty hunter in a fantastic looking armored suit as she explores an alien planet that is home to a group of space pirates. But these are not your usual humanoid space pirates. In fact, other than the lead, Samus, there aren't really any humanoids in this game, and though it's an action game, there is a real feeling of isolation to it. It almost feels like the film Aliens had Ripley been completely alone on that planet. As I mentioned way back when, it was developed by R&D1 and was overseen by Gunpei Yokoi, who was the man behind the Game & Watch. It was written and directed by Yoshihiro Sakamoto, who also directed Metroid Fusion, Metroid Zero Mission, Metroid Other M, as well as a bunch of game design work. Super Metroid not only has that great atmosphere, but it's just a ton of fun to play as well. I replay it myself every few years, and it was yet another Christmas present. But that's because that was mainly when I got games as a lad, was for Christmas. And yes, it's a sequel, but you can really just jump in and play without having to know anything at all about the first one. Being a classic game, it really isn't heavy on plot. And that's all the time we have for this week. I hope you enjoyed that, but I can tell by the looks on your faces you didn't. Please like, comment, subscribe, and keep it wacky.